Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Imran and I'm a former military officer. The reason why I chose this particular topic is I thought that perhaps in this talk I'll be able to bring my military career and the experience in the corporate world to talk on this topic rather than only the academic knowledge. I've divided the problem statement in two parts. In the first part, I would try and analyze how leadership is different in the public sector as compared to the corporate world. While in the second part, we'll see how this impacts the process of change in the defense and security context. Given this, I have the following agenda. Before really trying to explain the differences between the public sector and corporate world leadership, I would try to explain what actually leadership is, how it is defined in the corporate world, and how it is being defined in the public sector. And similarly, before jumping on how it impacts the process of change, I would endeavor to provide the defense and security context first in which we are trying to discuss the change. James MacGregor Burns in 1978 in his landmark work on leadership cited, "Leadership is perhaps one of the most observed and least understood phenomena on earth." Just a few years later, another very eminent scholar, Warren Bennis, came with the exact same conclusion in the mid-1980s. Bennis stated, "Never have so many labored so long to say so little." And leadership is one of the most studied and least understood topic of any in the social sciences. Ladies and gentlemen, these two statements are a proof enough that in next 18 to 20 minutes, I would perhaps be going through the most difficult route as I try and explain leadership differences between the public sector and the corporate world. And here I would like to highlight that I do understand that leadership is a verb while leader is a noun. And I have tried my level best not to confuse the two terms, but as I present, there may be instances where it has been very difficult to keep the leader separate from leadership. Let us explore the mainstream era of leadership theory and research. The focus on leadership in organization studies came in 1840s with Sir Thomas Carlyle when he presented his great man theory. According to this theory, leaders have specific traits. They possess specific characteristics. For example, intelligence, self-confidence, determination, integrity, flexibility, sociability, and emotional maturity. In the second half of the 20th century, the shift of focus from reading the leadership traits to observing and investigating leadership behaviors led these scholars to focus on leadership styles in individual organizational contexts. And later on, the contingency theory states that a particular leader can be effective in any given situation, provided he or she is flexible enough to assume the most suitable leadership style according to the situation. And it was not until 1978 that we started seeing the seeds of transactional and transformational leadership, which still form the mainstream in the contemporary debate. If you see, I have structured them in form of a prism, in form of a rectangular prism. And the main reason is that as we started exploring what leadership is, it was a very broader term. But as we kept on moving up and kept on exploring more, the focus became narrower and narrower. Now, this is true for any kind of research that we are doing. But over here, I would still argue that leadership is still a normative term. It is not a descriptive term. And social sciences normally would not do very good when it comes to explaining normative terminologies. Now, ladies and gentlemen, so far, leadership in the public sector has not occupied any autonomous domain in this particular topic. In 2003, Montgomery Van Wart published an article in Public Administration Review. And according to that article, he started to finalize and define what public sector leadership is. And most importantly, he highlighted a very significant question: how does public sector leadership exist on its very own? Or is it private sector leadership applied to the public domain? And answering this question, he completed a review of leadership in public sector and also identified the differences between public sector and corporate sector leadership. For the purposes of this presentation, I would like to stick with the definition presented by Van Wart. And according to Van Wart, leadership in public sector is the process of providing results required in an efficient, effective, and legal manner, developing and supporting followers who provide those results, and aligning the organization with its environment. Now, it is interesting. All the definitions that you viewed in the main era leadership, in the era of mainstream leadership theory and research, none of them identify leadership as a process, whereas Van Wart is identifying leadership as a process. And Van Wart's definition is category anchor in public administration domain. Let us see how literature defines the differences between leadership in the public sector and leadership in the corporate world. According to a review of literature, the first set of differences has to do with contextual complexity, as Brunner calls it. And the issues of contextual complexity apply to organization's mission, organization and environmental culture, structure, types of problems, types of issues, level of discretion, and a host of different other challenges. The very objective, the goal of public sector and corporate sector are extremely apart. One is profit-oriented, the other is service-oriented. Similarly, public sector organizations are stained with formalization and red tape as compared to private sector organizations, which are much more lean. Extensive surveys of executives in the public sector have revealed that executives feel they do not have the authority to hire, to fire, to reward their subordinates. And even a simple approval on a procurement decision would take much longer in a public sector as compared to the private sector. There are then a host of stakeholder differences. It is extremely difficult to identify stakeholders in the public sector, what to talk about bringing them on the same table. As compared to the private sector, we are continuously looking after stakeholder rights. We are continuously looking after stakeholder how you can support your stakeholders. For the public sector, it won't be wrong if we say what is good for God's birds is bad for God's farmer. Perhaps you cannot make everyone happy with the same policy. The most trending example is that of Brexit. Then literature says that accountability and sustainability is much higher in public sector as compared to the private sector. Although in the past decade we have seen that scrutiny and accountability is on its rise even in the private sector organizations with the Enron, with the financial crisis that the world saw. And perhaps this may be one of the points where the public and private sector are converging. And finally, decision making is a linear process if we are talking about the private sector, whereas decisions made are much more less direct in their impact in the public sector organizations because there are a host of variables involved. There are many factors involved once you are making a public policy, and single decision maker is not always the one who is taking those decisions as compared to the private sector where the leader is always the decision maker as well. If you were to ask me as a layman what are the differences between the public sector and the corporate world leadership, I would perhaps say that the differences are just like the differences between the British and the Americans. They do not speak a different dialect, but they also drive on the opposite sides. So far we have explained what leadership is, how it is defined in the corporate world, how it is defined in the public sector, and what are the differences. Now let us scan the global context for defense and security. Demands on defense and security in this particular sector have been on a rise. We all know after 9/11, things changed in retrospect, and defense sector has been under much more pressure in order to fight these insurgents. And therefore, since 1995 to 2011, defense sector spending has continuously been on a rise. There was a dip between 2011 to 2014, but back in 2015, the trend is again showing an upward rise. Alone in 2015, the total defense sector spending globally was 1,676 billion US dollars, which is equivalent to 2.3% of the global GDP, which shows that the sector in its demand is rising. Then presently we are operating in fourth generation warfare, which we call as insurgency warfare, where non-state actors are operating. And we are quickly this is the present state, but we are quickly moving towards fifth generation warfare, which is a lot about activation of cyberspace, weaponization of cyberspace, weaponization of space, which is media warfare. We have seen some glimpses, but they are not coordinated efforts, and there is much more to explore as we move ahead. Globalization and advancing technology, porous borders have presented a great advantage for the 4G insurgents who have been increasingly capitalizing on freight trades to their advantage, making best use of them, making best use of the porous borders, and equivalently they have also been using technology to their best usage. All the latest insurgency operations by non-state actors have been performed using making a heavy use of technology. The attacks on Pakistani military bases were planned on Google Maps. And finally, the impact of social media is turning up to become a very heavy component. Social media is becoming a giant. We recently saw how Turkey very effectively used social media to turn down a military coup. Moving ahead as we progress, social media would form a formidable tool for the militaries. We're already seeing that insurgents are using social media heavily for their recruitment purposes, for branding purposes. So you do need to have good grips on social media as you are moving ahead. In these circumstances, seeing the global trends and seeing the challenges that public sector faces, one would assume that change in the defense and security context would be extremely difficult. And it really is like that. But the research tells us that this is how it is for all the other sectors as well. According to a research, the successful change management is around 30%. The success rate in change management hovers around 30%. And one would assume that perhaps by this time, once we have put in a lot of efforts, things would change. Perhaps we should be doing a bit better on it. But there is an underlying semantic difference, and it is that we do not really understand the difference between transformation and change management. Change management is implementing finite initiatives which may or may not cut across the organization. The focus is on executing a well-defined shift in the way things work. While transformation is totally an other animal, it focuses on few discrete, well-defined shifts, but rather on a portfolio of initiatives which are interdependent or intersecting. And more importantly, the overall goal of transformation is not just to execute a defined change, but to reinvent the organization and to discover a new or revised business model based on a vision for the future. So we are talking about changing behaviors, changing mindsets, changing the capabilities that we have. And how do we do this? Simon Sinek provides a very good formula through his golden circle rule. The outermost circle, he says, represents what, and every one of us know what we are doing. The inner circle, the middle circle, represents why. Most of us know why we are doing, most of us know how we are doing what we are doing. But the innermost circle, the third circle, represents why. And it is why that distinguishes the successful from the ordinary. If we see the successful change management projects, we would see a pattern. All successful change management projects have focused on why instead of focusing on what. I'll be more clearer if I present this example. 28th of August 1963, 250,000 men turn up at Mall of Washington to listen to Sir Martin Luther King. They did not send any invitations, and there was no website to check the date. How do you do this? Well, Sir Martin Luther King went and told people that he believes. I believe, I believe, I believe, and what he believed and what others believed, and those who bought what he believed made his cause their own and took it to others, and they took it to others. And lo and behold, on the exact same date, there were 250,000 people who turned up. How many of them do you think came for Sir Martin Luther King? Zero. Because they came them for themselves. They came for their own cause. And that is what I'm talking about, why. How do you apply this to a defense and military context? Let me present to you a case study on McKinsey on defense and security within United Kingdom. UK's work on end-to-end logistics and military has become a case study. Instead of focusing on cost reduction, the program focused to deliver a number of operational improvements. This is what I'm saying, why. What would have been cost reductions? Why is operational improvement? And by presenting operational solution, a superior operation solution, the program secured full support of operational commanders. And how they implemented it is by reducing the deployed footprints, improving the supply processes, and also increasing the number of platforms. And through this, they were able to reduce delivery time in UK and January from 30 and Germany from 30 days to just 7 days. And the program also delivered most cost-effective solution. This is normally the case. Your solution that is operationally excellent will also be most cost-effective, though the converse is not always true. Usually in the military organizations, the second thing is that people would be ready to give up their budget, but they would not be ready to give up their authority. You need to transform, you need to delegate tasks to your team. Otherwise, you would never bring up a successful change management process. Ladies and gentlemen, this brings me to my conclusion. And before I really end this up, I would like to highlight that we have, through this presentation, learned what are the differences between the public sector and the corporate world. How this impacts the process of change. We analyzed that we should really be talking about transformation, changing mindsets, changing behaviors, instead of merely talking about change, which is much smaller. And finally, how to implement this successful transformation, the approach we need for that. I tried to present it in these 20 minutes. I know perhaps I would not have done justice because the topic is so vast. Still, I have tried to summarize it in as much clearer manner as I could. I look forward to your question and answers, and this concludes the presentation. Thank you very much.